Yeah, so thanks a lot to all of you for being here. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the ecosystem that's really been my passion here in Utah over the last 3 years, which are Piñon-juniper woodlands, which you can see in the background of this title slide here. I know that you've had a lot of people talk to you about this Piñon-juniper woodland ecosystem recently. I know Bill Gray gave an awesome talk about his giant junipers recently. That was really interesting. I was there for that one. I know that Stan Kitchen gave a talk in 2019. I saw that online. But I think today I'm going to add a little bit of a twist onto their presentations. And unfortunately, the twist is kind of a sad one because it pertains to some dying trees, some dying juniper trees, the ones in this picture in particular. This picture here is from southeastern Utah on Bears Ears National Monument, where really puzzlingly, one of the most drought tolerant trees in the Western United States, this Utah juniper, is dying back in a pretty striking way following a severe drought in 2018. So to understand why this is such a puzzling event, I think I need to do a little introduction of the main character of our story here, which is these Piñon-juniper woodlands. So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, I talk to people all the time about this, Piñon-juniper woodlands don't exactly have the best reputation depending on who you talk to. Juniper trees in particular can elicit some really strong emotions because juniper encroachment is happening into a lot of rangelands, which does affect grazing in some ways, though I will note that this juniper encroachment isn't really a problem here in Utah and in the Four Corners states more broadly. A lot of these woodlands have really been around for thousands and thousands of years, but even still, a lot of these Piñon-juniper woodlands in Utah are sporadically used for grazing purposes. And there's been a really long legacy of fights over what to do with these types of public lands in particular, which I'm sure a lot of you know the history of quite well. And a lot of these fights and debates over using these types of land have really resulted in some quite destructive land treatments to increase forage for grazing cattle. With chaining being a particularly bad example, where you just drive some heavy machinery with a chain attached between them and completely flatten all of the vegetation in an area with the idea that grasses grow back for cattle here. Now, just as an aside here, some of the field sites that I'm going to be talking to you today are located right here. This is actual satellite imagery just from last year of a number of my research plots. And you can notice that there's something a little bit different about that square of land in the middle. That was actually chained 50 years ago. And the legacy of that treatment still remains to this day. So the point I wanted to get across there is Piñon-juniper woodlands, or juniper trees in general, which are going to be the focus of this, can be a little bit contentious, but really I think they're just kind of misunderstood because they're wrapped up in these bigger debates about land use and change. And one of the reasons I think they're so misunderstood is because they're an incredibly important ecosystem for the southwestern United States. They're the most common forest type in our region here. They cover 36 million acres. I think some estimates have it even as high as 50 million acres over 10 states in the western US and actually spilling into northern Mexico here. And obviously, as I'm sure all of you Utahns know here, this ecosystem really forms the backdrop of some of the most iconic public lands in America, Zion, Arches, Canyonlands National Parks, all the other amazing public lands in, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah area. These Piñon-juniper woodlands are also important because they host a wide variety of plant and animal species. And in many cases, some really old trees. A lot of these junipers can live to, 500, even 1,000 years old. And importantly, there's a lot of biocrest activity in these ecosystems, which is one of the most important components that kind of holds the health of these ecosystems together. And from a different perspective, and one that's particularly close to my heart, these Piñon-juniper woodlands are incredibly important because over the last 2 decades or so, these woodlands have become kind of a model ecosystem for understanding how trees in particular respond to drought stress. Kind of in a twist of fate here, I did my graduate school work out in Indiana, and a lot of the foundational knowledge and theories that I was working with out there were actually developed 15 or 20 years ago in Piñon-juniper woodlands in New Mexico, And what I was doing is trying to apply some of that knowledge to ecosystems in the Midwest and in the Eastern United States that had just been hit with a really severe drought in 2012. And so it's been really fun to switch back over here to Utah and work in all of these ecosystems that I learned so much about for 5 years in grad school. The final thing to note here about Piñon-juniper woodlands is this ecosystem type is in a little bit of trouble. Across the Southwest more broadly, but specifically in the eastern and southeastern part of Utah, a lot of these Piñon-juniper woodlands are really rapidly warming and drying in the summer. As you can see here with this heat map, it's just temperature change in degrees Celsius since 1985, and you can see this sort of hotspot centered around southeastern Utah, which coincidentally is right near some of the field plots that I'm going to talk about today. These ecosystems aren't just in trouble because they're getting hotter during the summers. We're also seeing across Utah and across the western United States more broadly, really huge decreases in soil moisture and snowpack. This graph is from a number of governmental agencies that have these snow monitoring stations in the mountains. And what you can see is that there's a lot of red and the points are quite large, which means that on the whole in this monitoring network, we've seen in the last 50, 60 years, about on average a 50% reduction in the amount of snowpack during winter. And this is a lot of trouble for agriculture. This means a lot of negative impacts for winter recreation, including all of the ski resorts right here in Salt Lake City or near here in Salt Lake City. And of course, we as humans depend a lot on this snow melt for our own personal consumption. But these reductions in winter snowpack also matter a lot for ecosystems that depend heavily on this winter precipitation to recharge the soil and kind of act as a buffer as really hot, dry summers roll in. And in a lot of the very arid landscapes in the southern part of the state, this snowpack is incredibly important for sustaining vegetation health during these really hot, dry, long summer periods. Okay, so just to stop here and think for a second. Yes, Utah is incredibly dry. You can see from this picture that I took from southern Utah. Water availability already controls a ton of which vegetation grows where in the state. Why do we really care if it's getting a little bit drier? Well, one of the reasons that we care is that we're seeing a couple new different types of drought trends. So what's new is really the length and severity of drying trends that we've seen over the past couple of decades. This is a title from a recent paper that just came out last year that has used a tree ring chronologies to document that since the year 2000 or so, the southwestern region of the United States in general has been in the second driest multi-decadal period in the last 1200 years. You can see on this graph how this area that I've circled in red is the second lowest point, so they reconstructed soil moisture in this case, up until this period 1200 years ago. And they gave this ongoing 20-year drought this really kind of flashy name of a mega drought, which I think really perfectly encapsulates what we're seeing here. This is something that is almost unprecedented, and at least unprecedented in the last couple of 100 years or so. Now, as if being in this mega drought period wasn't bad enough, in the past 20 years, we've seen kind of a new type of annual drought. So these shorter type of droughts, which many people have termed a global change type drought. What this means is that it's not just a drought in the sense that you don't get much precipitation, but you're getting this anomalously low precipitation that is layered on top of extremely hot conditions, in some cases even heat waves. And around 20 years ago, we had a number of these hot, dry global change type droughts roll in the southwestern United States. These happened in '96, and then there was a kind of a multi-year one from 2002 to 2003, and even a little bit in 2004. And the consequences of these droughts in many of the Piñon-juniper woodlands across the region were extremely severe, which is what this picture shows right here. Canopy cover in a lot of places was reduced by over 50%. And an important thing to note was that it was mostly pinyon trees, one of these two constituent species in Piñon-juniper woodlands. That's the species that ended up dying. Pinion mortality was much, much higher than that of various juniper species. So since those droughts 20 years ago, there's been a lot of work on the ecology and the physiology of pinyon trees and juniper trees. And we've been able to draw really clear links between the physiology of pinyon pine in particular and why 20 years ago, in response to these droughts, it tended to die off in fairly large numbers. The first key point here is that pinions have xylem that are very vulnerable to hydraulic damage. If you recall, xylem are the tissues in the plant that conduct water from the soil through the roots, through the stem, to the leaves, and out to the atmosphere. And actually, this water is being pulled through the plant by the atmosphere through the xylem. So it actually travels through the plant against gravity out to the atmosphere under negative tension. And negative tension is not the most intuitive concept to grasp, but an analogy that I like to use is that the water in the plant is being pulled on by the atmosphere in a similar way as you might pull on a rubber band. And what happens when there's less water in the soil? The air is drier, it's pulling on that water in the xylem harder. But similar to if you pull a rubber band really hard, something is going to snap. And what ends up happening with the water column in a plant is that these little tiny air bubbles spontaneously form inside the xylem. These are called embolisms, or just hydraulic damage more broadly. And these little tiny air bubbles are semi-permanent or even permanent in some cases, and they completely block water flow through the xylem vessel that they're taken up in. And if you're a plant that can't move water, you're going to be in pretty dire straits pretty quickly. So the second relevant aspect of pinyon physiology that explains why it's traditionally died off following severe droughts is that it's really reliant on kind of patches of summer precipitation to sustain its health. I mentioned a couple of slides ago that a lot of these ecosystems are really dependent on winter precipitation to kind of recharge the soil profile and serve as this buffer of moisture during really hot summers. But pinions in general do a whole lot better if they get a couple little rainstorms in the summer, perhaps coming from the monsoon, perhaps in the early spring. They can really efficiently take that stuff up and really use it to sustain themselves. So given those two facts, what happens if a drought comes in where you have really low winter precipitation, and one of these hot, dry, global change type droughts is, well, that rubber band of the plant's water column gets pulled on harder. You get those little air bubbles form, you have hydraulic damage. The plant can't move water, it can't photosynthesize. If it can't photosynthesize, it's not getting any energy that's fixed from carbon dioxide. And if it doesn't have a lot sitting in that bank account of energy from photosynthesis, it can't really invest in its own defenses in the way that it normally would. And in the case of pinyon pine, if it can't invest in its own defenses, then usually what comes in is this Ips beetle here, which bores into the tree and many times carries with it a blue stain fungus. And the combination, the kind of double whammy of these two different biotic factors is actually what ends up killing a lot of these pinions following drought. So it's kind of this whole chain of consequences starting with a drought. So that's in general how pinyon pines die. But the key point here is that these juniper trees, these co-occurring species, have some of the most resistant xylem around to these little embolisms for various anatomical reasons that I'm happy to go into later, but won't right now. And also a lot of these junipers tend to be really, really deep rooted. And so they don't necessarily need as much summer precipitation as pinions might to remain healthy. So I want to stop on this point just for a little bit to mention that the way these pinions die is actually really common across a lot of tree species in general, but especially conifers in the West. This here is a conceptual graph that I really like for visualizing how most trees die to drought. They kind of get initiated onto this death spiral where you have a healthy tree, maybe other plants come in and start competing for its water, which is really scarce in a lot of these places. And then a drought hits, and then in come the insects and the diseases that ultimately cause the tree's death here. But this spiral isn't necessarily preordained. There, you can see there are a lot of little escape routes. You know, maybe you outcompete your neighbors, you win. Maybe you can recover from the drought. Maybe you can mount a successful defense on whatever insects or diseases are coming in and trying to hurt you. And so this spiral of mortality here is what killed these piñons 20 years ago during these severe droughts. But in 2018, right when I moved to Utah, actually the summer of 2018, here comes another really severe drought. And this drought, in fact, was probably more severe than any individual year of these droughts 20 years ago. I have a graph here from southeastern Utah showing that, you know, the water year of 2020 had, which incorporates the previous winter and the summer, had lower precipitation and lower vapor pressure deficit, which is just a measure of how dry the air was. So it was probably a worse drought than what we saw 20 years ago. But this time something different is happening in that it's the junipers that are dying. And they're dying really, really quickly, which is an extremely surprising observation. We went out and observed a ton of juniper dieback in November 2018. So just a few months after, you know, the summer ended and still during the drought period. And the reason this is so surprising is there've been a number of experiments done in New Mexico and other places where they've experimentally reduced precipitation by 50 or 90% on these junipers. And even in those extreme cases, it took years for these things to start browning and dying back. So as far as we can tell, the pace of this is extremely surprising and odd. So that got our brains churning here. And we really wanted to get at this question a number of ways. As a first step, we just want to do some basic work documenting the severity and the spatial scale of this dieback. We wanted to kind of figure out exactly what's killing these trees, because the speed and severity of this is, you know, so surprising. And juniper is normally this extremely drought hardy species. And finally, we wanted to ask really the critical question here, you know, is this a one-off event, or is this kind of an indicator of a pretty grim future for Piñon-juniper woodlands? So brief description of the method. If anyone really cares, I'm happy to answer more questions later, but it's just kind of a cool way to map these things. So I thought I'd mention it. What we ended up doing is in a number of areas in San Juan County in southeastern Utah, we flew just a commercial drone over some of these Piñon-juniper woodlands. And we also flew a plane that was equipped with a laser scanning instrument called LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. It's what they, I think, at least used to, maybe still currently use for a lot of self-driving cars and things like that. And what the LiDAR enabled us to do was understand the shape and the extent of individual tree crowns, which you can see mapped out here on the left. And then when we layer just the standard video imagery or photographic imagery on top of that, we can start to look at, you know, the color of these individual tree crowns and understand if they're dead, if they're alive, if they're partially dead, these sorts of things. And once we understand the nuances of that relationship, we can scale up to the broader region using some global satellite imagery products and a bunch of different statistical techniques to create maps of estimated Piñon-juniper dieback following the 2018 drought across San Juan County that I've highlighted here in yellow. So this map here is just a snapshot of what we found, but I think it does a really good job of highlighting a few key things. Number one is that there was a lot of low-level dieback following this 2018 drought in the year 2019. 39% of the Piñon-juniper woodlands in San Juan County, which are the intersection of the green here and the yellow county map, 39% had some detectable level of dieback following this drought. But in general, it was quite low level. And instead, we found that really severe dieback was localized in these hotspots, right, where we had 40, 50, even 60% of the canopy dying back as far as our model could tell us here. Now, when this map was made, I got really excited because at the same exact time, I was on the ground in the field in San Juan County setting up a bunch of survey plots so we could validate these with ground level data. And sure enough, these 3 hotspots were exactly the regions where I had ended up setting up a lot of these survey plots, and it matched really well in terms of where we were detecting this dieback and in terms of the overall canopy dieback that we ended up seeing. So once we move on from the initial question of where is this occurring, how severe this is, we really wanted to know what's causing this dieback. This is something that we really haven't seen before as far as I can tell. And the first thought was that there's going to be some role of pests or pathogens, insects, diseases, these things that tend to kill ultimately conifers in the West. And this makes sense given what we've seen a lot of other drought-induced mortality events in the region. So with a number of fantastic Forest Service colleagues, we went and did a lot of sampling for some of the common insects and diseases that could be causing this. And interestingly, we didn't find anything. They didn't have much in the way of insects or diseases. We didn't really find anything except these secondary insects that kind of come in and start chewing on a dying or an already dead tree. It was nothing that would have infected a previously healthy tree, and nothing that was really severe enough to cause that level of canopy dieback in the first place. And actually, we followed up on this just a couple of months ago with a whole crew of people from the Forest Service and the BLM and the DNR and all of these amazing people who study the insects and diseases of these areas. And with that small army of people, we confirmed even a couple of years later, there was really nothing around that could have caused this dieback. It was just things that are chewing on already dead trees. So we really didn't see any sort of sign that other living agents could have caused this juniper dieback, but instead we were able to explain this with some really simple principles of plant ecology and physiology. And one of the most striking trends that popped out to us was there was a really strong elevation signal with this dieback. We saw the juniper dieback was much, much hotter at lower elevation sites, and really, I won't say non-existent, but much, much lower at some of the higher elevation sites that we had set up these survey plots at. And this makes perfect sense. Lower elevation sites tend to be much, much hotter and drier. And so we also saw a really strong signal where the sites that were hotter during 2018, or I could make this graph with any number of climate variables or drought indices, the hotter it was, the drier it was, the more juniper dieback that there was. The other thing that really popped up at us was that we saw that the health of the plant's hydraulic system played a really big role in this dieback. This graph here is showing juniper dieback on the y-axis, and on the x is hydraulic damage, which is just what percentage of those xylem vessels are blocked up by those little bubbles of embolism. And we saw that the more embolism there was, probably due to drought stress, the more dieback there was. So it seems like, on its surface, we can draw some really simple conclusions about why these junipers died. We had a really severe drought in 2018 that by some metrics was even more severe than these ones that rolled through with the 20 years ago or so. The drought was exacerbated at these hotter, drier, low elevation sites. What happens when you expose these trees to a severe drought? They're going to have damage to their hydraulic system, they block water flow, the tree can't photosynthesize, and the foliage starts dying back. So this seems really, really simple on its surface, but at least to me, there's a really key question that's kind of lurking here, which is why juniper and why now? Juniper have survived every other drought in the region. These things have survived the drought in the early 2000s. A lot of these trees are hundreds of years old. They've survived all of those droughts that we don't have weather data to quantify. So why juniper? And why did this happen so fast? As I said before, it normally takes years for these things to die back if you almost entirely cut off their water supply experimentally. And weirdly enough, we didn't even see evidence of that spiral that we saw, there was no sort of biotic attack that ended up, being reasonably linked to their eventual dieback. Well, our hypothesis here is that these trees have sort of been on a different kind of spiral, but purely due to cumulative drought effects. So they're kind of on this drought spiral of declining health due to this 20-year mega drought drying trend and all of these different shorter, more acute droughts over the period. So maybe it's just that these normally drought tolerant trees have reached a tipping point. And just to kind of back up that point here, this is a graph of mean summer temperature at these sites. And you can see the past 20 years highlighted in red there. Temperature has gone up by a lot. It's gotten a lot hotter and a lot drier in the region. And right when this mega drought period started, we saw a couple of outbreaks of pinyon mortality. And now 20 years later or 15 years later, we're starting to see a little bit more localized of an outbreak of mortality in juniper. So this research is still ongoing here, and we really want to tackle it from a number of different perspectives. And one of our main goals for the future is really to figure out if these junipers have been in this cycle of long-term decline. How long have they been in the cycle of long-term decline, and what exactly does that even mean? What does it look like? How can we measure that? The problem here, well, I guess the challenge is that all the data I showed previously was from the year after these trees died back, when we went out and collected a bunch of data. It's just a snapshot when the trees were in pretty rough shape, and it's really difficult to diagnose any sort of long-term decline from data just from 1 year, kind of at the end of this dieback event. You can't diagnose this decline that in many cases could be taking decades. Luckily, there are a number of data sources that can really help us get at these long-term dynamics. Specifically, tree rings. If you're not familiar with tree rings, I'm sure you've seen them in a stump or on a piece of wood or something like that. But trees in general put on one annual ring per year, and that it differs in color. And that's why you can discern the wood it's put down in 1 year versus the other. It puts down denser, darker wood at the end of the growing season when growth slows. So what we can do is reach back in time and measure the width of these individual tree rings and see how much the tree was growing in any individual year. And in a very water limited, dry environment like southeastern Utah, or honestly most of the southwestern United States, growth is primarily driven by the availability of water. So ring widths in general reflect how dry it was in a given year. So we want to take advantage of this, the trees giving this amazing resource to reach back in their history and find out what was going on. So a couple months ago, I went down to all of the plots that I showed you earlier and cut down a bunch of trees. Here's me cutting down one of the pinyon pines that was looking pretty healthy in the region. I had a permit for this, so don't report me. But what we wanted to do was cut down a wide range of species that were in different states of decline, from very healthy trees to very unhealthy trees. And we took these cross sections from the trees, polished them up using really fine grained sandpaper, and took them to the Natural History Museum, where Bill Gray has done an amazing job of creating this really cutting edge, high resolution, automated imagery system along with Mitch Power. And this has allowed us to get some really cool images like the one in the background there, where we can measure the tree rings and figure out other different qualities. So what exactly are we looking for with these tree ring widths? Well, we're looking for some of the symptoms of trees being on this spiral of long-term decline. And these have been called, early warning signs, which I think is a really good term because they can kind of be used as an indicator that foreshadows eventual dieback or mortality of a tree. And in tree rings, this can take a number of forms. So for example, perhaps during this mega drought period, you're seeing this progressively lower growth rate because the trees are much more water stressed. They're not growing as much. Another really common early warning sign that we're going to be looking for is increased variability in growth year to year as trees really struggle more than they should during a dry period because of all this cumulative stress. And then in a wet year, they kind of overcompensate and use all their resources to try and recover, many times unsuccessfully. So this is what we're looking for with these tree ring records. And we're also trying to take this early warning signs approach, not just at our plots in Bears Ears National Monument, but across the whole Four Corners region. So hopefully, we'll see if this works out. We want to discern some of these early warning signs of long-term woodland decline using some of these satellite imagery products. So can we detect changes in the color and the structure of a lot of these ecosystems that you can discern from some of these satellites? And this is really going to just allow us to understand the trajectory of these forests over the past number of decades and understand some of the potentially cool interplay between what happened during the droughts 20 years ago and what we're seeing today. And another somewhat pie in the sky objective here of this work is we're hoping that we can develop really neat predictions of the woodlands that are going to be in trouble during the near future when the next severe drought hits, because we're hoping that we can diagnose some of these regions where they've been showing some of these signs of an early warning sign of this kind of last gasp, but don't have any sort of observable dieback quite yet. So this is kind of an aside here, but I want to mention another really cool thing that we can do with these great tree ring samples, specifically with pinyon pine. If you recall earlier, I mentioned that bark beetles and the fungus that's associated with them are historically what tends to be the kind of ultimate cause of mortality of these pinyons following drought, especially 20 years ago. Well, these trees aren't defenseless. They're not just waiting around for one of these things to come in and start chewing on it. The resin that they produce, the really sticky stuff, acts as a deterrent for these beetles, but it's very expensive energetically for the tree to make it cut. It costs a lot of resources. And so kind of we're thinking we want to know how these pinyon pines' ability to defend themselves has changed during this 20-year mega drought period, and maybe even in response to some of these shorter, more acute droughts that have occurred over the region in the past 20 years. And so once again, the imaging setup that we have gets such great high resolution pictures that we can actually count and measure the individual resin ducts in a given ring. And these resin ducts are where these resins are produced and stored. And so you can see what the tree's investment in a given year was towards its own defense. So ultimately, the impetus for this work here is not just to understand what's happening right now, but to understand something about what is going to be the medium or long-term fate of these Piñon-juniper woodland systems as the ecosystem only gets warmer and only gets drier into the future. I don't want to go into a ton of detail here, but one of the really neat things that we're doing is we're hoping to be able to run a number of mathematical models where we can simulate the physiology of these trees and really understand woodland health under kind of a range of different potential trajectories that the climate of the region could undergo into the future, really with an eye towards not only what are these trees going to be able to do in order to cope with drought stress, but is more dieback going to happen in the future and where? And using these models is really, it's all well and good. These things are really important tools that a lot of people use for understanding the future. We can get a lot of insight into these ecosystems with these type of approaches. But in some ways, the future really is now. We're currently in a really bad drought. So this is a picture of the Jordanelle Reservoir out near Park City that I took a couple of years ago. It's, I think, around 65% of its normal capacity. And I just thought this is a really striking way with some of those bathtub rings that you see in Lake Powell, Lake Mead, and areas like that, just to show how little moisture we've had over the past couple years here. And this drought has really been developing since early 2020. So this has been a pretty long-term trend so far. This is a US drought monitor from May 2020. The colors just indicate the severity of the drought. And for all intents and purposes here, the red and the dark red colors are really bad. So in early 2020, we started out with a lot of moderate drought in the state, a couple pockets of severe drought. But once we got to the end of the summer here in September, most of the state was in extreme drought, and certain pockets out west were in exceptional drought. And you can see this drought trend is not just happening in Utah, but really exploding across the western half of the United States. But in a lot of the Four Corners states, there was a really poor monsoon and a really poor early winter precipitation. And so by the time December 2020 rolls around, most of Utah, most of Arizona, a ton of places are in this exceptional drought, which is pretty bad news. And this is continuing now. It's pretty much unchanged if I flip back and forth here. This was the drought monitor just from 1 week ago. So if you aren't familiar with the drought monitor, which I wouldn't expect many of you to be, just for a comparison here, this is what 2018 looked like when all of those all of the junipers died back. Much less severe drought across the western United States, but in that Four Corners region where we are seeing the juniper dieback, you're seeing that exceptional drought. So the answer to this question, what is the future of these forests in a warming and drying world? The answer is likely something like this image here. This is an image that Stan Kitchen took out near the Wawa Mountains in west central Utah, where he and a number of others are observing a lot of really recent juniper mortality. And this here is an image that Doug Page sent me very recently of some other very recent, as in just the past few months, juniper dieback in northern Arizona. And we've also had reports of juniper dieback in southwestern Colorado. So it seems like we just saw potentially the tip of the iceberg with this juniper dieback in San Juan County in 2018, 2019. And what we're seeing right now as these drought conditions have expanded is a much more potentially widespread event. But I guess that's not very happy news, but from a scientific perspective, there's somewhat good news in that what we've learned from the initial this initial outbreak of juniper dieback in 2018, 2019, we're pretty well positioned to monitor this drought as it develops. And luckily, a few years ago, we installed a really kind of cutting edge suite of drought monitoring sensors to do just that, which are all strapped to this tower here that you can see in this image. And this thing's pretty much a very fancy weather station. It can measure things like precipitation, temperature, humidity, but also importantly, we installed a profile of soil moisture sensors from the surface all the way to bedrock, which is really important in understanding what the plant might be seeing in terms of drought stress. And the coolest part of this thing is that white claw-shaped thing at just below the top of it, which allows you to do a methodology called eddy covariance, which in essence allows you to measure the forest as it breathes. You can see how much carbon is going into the ecosystem during the day as the plants photosynthesize, and how much carbon is going out as the microbes in the soil and the plants respire aerobically, just as we do. They exhale carbon dioxide functionally. And we can do the same thing with water. With this tower, we can measure it coming in. We can see it move through all of the different soil layers. And using this eddy covariance technique, we can see how much of it is lost from evaporation from the soil and how much of it is lost through the plant out of the leaves. And the final thing that we're doing here is all of that monitoring station is awesome. It's been operational since 2019. We've learned a ton about how drought and carbon and water operate in this ecosystem, but it doesn't quite let us know exactly how the plant is feeling about a drought. We can infer some things, right? We can measure how much water there is in the soil. We can measure how much water it's losing. We can measure how much the plants are photosynthesizing, which is kind of an indirect measure of how healthy they are, but we're really not asking the plant how they feel about that. We're just kind of taking a guess. But a few weeks ago, we tried to remedy that problem, and we went down and underneath that tower installed a number of really cool sensors, which are there in that image. And these things are given the very fancy name of stem cyclometers. But what these things do is they continuously monitor the health of the plant's hydraulic system. They can measure continuously how hard that water column is being pulled on, how hard that rubber band is being pulled up. So we can really kind of track water as it moves through the ecosystem and out through the plant, which is really neat. But all of this is done with an eye towards getting a really good handle about how the ongoing drought is impacting the health of these junipers. And I don't know what the future entails here, but when I was down there strapping these things to these trees and driving around the region, I was seeing already this early in the year, in mid-May, already a number of needles of these trees dying back. So who knows what the future here is going to hold. I guess we'll have the answer in a couple months. To summarize here, I presented a lot on some of the science that we're doing and some of the the stories and the narratives around these Piñon-juniper woodlands and a lot of the ongoing climatic trends. But I think there are really a few key take-home points here. And the first is that these junipers, these really drought-tolerant species, may have been pushed to, kind of pushed to the brink or pushed to their threshold due to these increasingly common short acute droughts on top of this longer term drying trend that we've been seeing across the region. I think everybody should be concerned about this as these changes are happening to a really important and iconic landscape. Point number two is more from a scientific perspective here. I think the changes underway in this region are really going to cause us in the scientific community to really re-examine what we thought we knew about Piñon-juniper woodland ecology and the responses of these two different tree species to drought. Because if junipers are one of these traditionally most drought tolerant species that we know of here in the Western United States, and all of a sudden they were dying in 2018 and they're seemingly dying back again now. If the most drought tolerant tree in the West is dying back, then what can really take its place, and what's this ecosystem going to look like in the decades to come? And unfortunately, maybe this year is the start of being able to answer that question. Great. With that, I'd just like to acknowledge the people who've been really instrumental in making this work happen, and the different funding agencies who've been really supportive of all of this research. So happy to take any questions here.